Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi, the Mai Pedig Vav Halacha Aleph. We're going to be learning today Daf Nun Beis. We left off on Daf Nun Beis all the way on top of the Amid. We're going to begin by the Gemara giving a quick introduction, just to clarify the difference between a Mekabel, between a Choicher, between a Soicher. But we're going to really go back to what the Gemara described to be a Machloikis between Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, whose opinion is quoted in our Mishnah Stam, and the Chachamim regarding a person, a Yid, who is a Mekabel, who is a sharecropper on land that's owned by a non-Jew. So in our Mishnah, we learned that if you have a Jew that's a Choicher, he's a tenant farmer, which means he pays a fixed amount of produce from that field as rent. According to everyone, the Mishnah differentiates between whether the owner is a Yid versus whether the owner of the land is a non-Jew. By the case where the owner is a non-Jew, the Mishnah says, Ma'aser v'noisamoi, that the Jewish choicher, prior to giving the fixed amount, let's say the 10 pounds of produce as rent, as lease, he has to first take off trumas and maisis. Even though what he's giving to the goy doesn't have to be ma'ased anything. And the reason for that is, as we explained in the Mishnah, this is really a rabbinic penalty, which is enacted in order to discourage such a lease, which means that really we don't want for non-Jews to have ownership in the land of Eretz Yisrael. And if they buy land, for, fields, and they won't be able to get workers, l'chatchila, they won't invest in it, that's the kavanah. And a others will hesitate to lease a land by a goy because he knows that not only does he have to pay that fixed amount, which was probably the norm fixed amount, he has to, prior to that, he has to take off trumas and maisis. That's the way we learned in the Mishnah. Now, what happens if a Jew is a mekabel from a goy? Our Mishnah says that choylik lifneihem. The Gemara clarifies that our Mishnah is only the sheet of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, who indeed holds that the Jewish mekabel doesn't need to separate anything. He simply takes his part, a half, a third, a fourth, where he leaves a half, a third, or a fourth, and the owner, the goy, takes his portion. However, the Chachamim hold an opinion that's not brought down in the Mishnah, that there is also a penalty. The penalty is not as extensive as it is by a choicher, but by a mekabel, toirim. And I know yesterday we got stuck. Why toirim? Like Miman Afshach. And I know that we shared one approach in the Rashirilio, just to share the other approach in the Rashirilio, that it is also a rabbinic decree, also with a bigger intent of preventing non-Jewish ownership in the land of Israel. But over here, if we're going to say even by the mekabel that they have to be ma'aser v'noisnuloi all the way, then many lands will remain completely untilled. In other words, we don't want for Eretz Yisrael to remain fallow. So you have this balancing act. On one hand, we want people to work the land. On the other hand, we prefer to have Yiddish ownership in the land. The word preference is a weak word. We don't want for there to be non-Jewish ownership in the land. And therefore, they figured that giving this part penalty is enough to discourage goyim from owning it, because they know that not only will they have a hard time finding a choicher, which is what they prefer, they will even have a hard time finding a mekabel, all the dasa chachamim, because the mekabel will have to be toirim v'noisam loy. On the other hand, they'll find a mekabel, because taking off 2% is not the end of the world, certainly not in comparison to taking off around 22%. Okay, that is where we left off yesterday. Now, the Gemara is going to introduce the entire topic in the reverse, meaning that our Mishnah is speaking about a Jew. He's the one leasing, right? He's the mekabel, he's the choicher. And the question is, who owns the land? So in the Mishnah, we had either a Yid owns the land, or a Goy owns the land, or a Kuti owns the land. That is all the Mishnah's case. Our Gemara is going to introduce a scenario where it's mamish the opposite. We're going to introduce a Braisa where we're going to be speaking exclusively about a Jewish owner. However, the Jewish owner is leasing his field. In other words, the sharecropper, the mekabel, or the choicher, or the tenant farmer they are either Jews or lahabdul goyim. That will be the case of the Braisa. And just to understand, to appreciate our Braisa, that Midoi Raisa, based on a pasuk in Parshas Vo Eschanon, where the Torah says, V'loi sichanem, Chazal have three completely different limudim from Loi sichanem. One of the understandings of the Lav Midoi Raisa, V'loi sichanem, is that we are not allowed to give Goyish ownership in the land of Israel. V'loi sachanem, that's the way we would put the vowels. Don't allow them to have a holding in the land. So selling a land to a goy is also midoi raisa. And based on that, the Chachamim, the Rabbanan, prohibited for a yid to lease a field to a goy, whether the goy is a sharecropper, whether he's a tenant farmer, all of that is also midrabanan. Now, the Braisa will be speaking about a scenario where someone violated that Isur Darabanan, and he does have a goyish tenant working the land, and we'll see again how the Braisa will be applying the topic of our Mishnah, Choylik Lifneim, Toidem, Ma'aseh, V'chulei, as we will see when we unpackage this Gemara. We will also have an extension to the Isur Darabanan that we just mentioned, based on the Isur Daraisa, V'loi sichanem. We're going to quote a machloikes tanoim between Rav Meir and Rav Yosi regarding leasing fields in Syria. In other words, Syria was conquered in a way that we call it kibush yachid. It doesn't have the full-fledged kedushas Eretz Yisrael. On the other hand, it was in the times of Chazal a place where Yidden lived, but not to the degree at all as where Yidden lived in Eretz Yisrael. And the point all will be that we prefer for Yidden to be the ones renting out, but if you don't have any of them available, which is the case of Syria, so there's a machloikes, Rav Meir and Rav Yosi, and the Gemara will extend that machloikes even in Eretz Yisrael proper, in locations where in the times of the Gemara, already the Jewish communities were no longer there. As we had just a few daf ago, Har HaMelech and other such areas, large areas in Eretz Yisrael, that in the times at least of the Gemara, and perhaps even B'Soif Zman HaMishnah, because of the Roman conquest, it was basically areas where Goyim were living. So what would be the point to make an Isur Darabanan if you happen to own land, not to lease it out to a Goy, because of a Loi Sechanim, they already have a holding on the land, there's no Yidden there, B'chlal. If you're not going to have a Yid, the land will remain fallow, and that goes against the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. And B'chlal will have more braises that will be discussing the tithing obligations of a mekabel. That is more or less the base. And let's go right inside. So we are at the end of the top line of the daf. Before we go back to the machloikes, like we mentioned in the intro, between Rabbi and Shimon ben Gamliel and the Chachamim, right? That the Chachamim in the Braisa is also machalek by a mekabel between whether you are leasing it from a Yid or lahabdul from a Goy. The Chachamim hold that the mekabel who's a Jew has to be at least toidim. So before that, the Gemara just clarifies, I know we spoke this out yesterday, that whenever Chazal use the words choicher, ches chaf, ha-choicher bepeiros, what does that mean? You're a choicher. Choicher means that you're paying a fixed amount. So why are you not called a renter? Because you're paying it from the produce that you are growing. Paydos doesn't only mean paydos. Paydos means the paydos from that field. Now, of course, the produce. Now, of course, if there was a drought and nothing grew in that field, you're chayiv to pay that paydos, and you'll get it from another field. But the concept of a tenant farmer is that the worker understands, I don't own the land, I'm going to work the land, but I'll pay from the land and whatever the agreement is, but a fixed amount. That's a choicher. Ha-soicher, the word soicher is used when you pay with money, b'mois. And ha-mekabel, and parenthetically, in many other areas, we use the word an adis, with the saf at the end, with the samach at the end. So ha-mekabel means l'mechza, l'shlish, v'l'revia, depending all on the minhag hamakim of how much percent do you pay, whether you pay half, whether you pay a third, whether you pay a fourth, or vice versa, whether you get to keep a third or keep a fourth. Everything depends on the minhag hamakim. Okay. Says the Gemara. At Kedoim, see in our Mishnah, when we spoke about a mekabel, the Mishnah began in the case of a mekabel, and the Mishnah spoke about your mekabel from a Yid, the Yisrael, you can look inside, right, from a Nachri and from a Kuti. We put them all together, and again, our Mishnah follows the Shita of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, that simply choylik lifneihem, that no tithing has to be separated, as we learned yesterday. You're not allowed to pay your debt with Tevel. We don't view the percent being left by the lease, by the makabel to the owner. We don't see that as paying a debt. They're like partners. Everyone is just taking their part, and therefore, choylik lifneihem, compounded where you might think will make a takana. Indeed, as we found in the Gemara, Shitas Chachamim, so that's what we learned yesterday, the Gemara Fulda, that not only that because of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, we don't want the land to remain fallow. We dafka don't even make a derabbanan dika penalty, even though we prefer for Goyim not to own the land because we don't want the land to remain fallow. Okay, that is all in it. Now, when the Gemara introduced the Braisa, telling you that our Mishnah is only Rabban Shimon and Gamliel, the Chachamim actually hold that Toidem v'noisen loy. The Braisa was speaking about a Jew that was a makabel from a goy. Toidem, that the Chachamim hold Toidem v'noisen loy. What about if a Yid is a makabel from a kuti? The Braisa didn't say. Now, don't forget that it's a twofold issue. Number one, there's a machlekes tanaim whether kuti and a Yid or goy. If a kuti is considered a goy, then a kuti is an achri. There's nothing to talk about. But most of the tanoim in those times felt kutim dinam kiyid, like we learned already in this mesechta. Elama, they were not makabel Torah Shabal Peh. They misinterpreted lifnei iver l'sita nichshol. When you buy produce from them, it's hevel. I get that, but they're not goyim. So what will be the din if you were to lease it from a kuti? Now again, the Mishnah that only quotes Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel with the lenient opinion of choylik lifneihem. Befedish says Yemakabel mi min Yisrael min Anochri min Akuti that choylik lifneihem. But what about Shitas Chachamim in the Braisa, where the Braisa only spoke about Anochri? That's the Gemara's kash. That at kedoin that the Chachamim hold that a Jew who's a makabel from a Nachri toidem. That's when the owner is a Nachri. And let's go to what we said today. Why toidem? They made a part penalty also to discourage goyim from owning land, but they didn't want the land to remain fallow, so they didn't add. If according to the Chachamim, if the Chachamim would make a decree that no matter whether you're a choichet or whether you're a makabel, you have to take off all of the maasros. Taka, no Jew would become a worker for a goy. So on one hand, it would really discourage goyim to own it. On the other hand, that which they own would remain fallow, which they also didn't want. Anyway, so only toidim. The question is, kuti, what will be the din by a kuti? Would the Chachamim hold that a kuti would be like by a Yid, like our Mishnah, that choylik lifneihem, or will the kuti be dinoi kedin nachri, that if you're a makabel lechachamim, you also have to be toidim? The Braisa didn't say, so we're going to want to prove it by the following. So the Gemara says that nishma'ina min hadam. I'll prove it to you. I will know the shita of the Chachamim from the following Braisa. Now, this Braisa is speaking about the reverse case of the Mishnah. Elama, this Braisa doesn't record whether it's Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel or whether it's the Chachamim. We're going to prove that the following Braisa, that's a different topic, well, the same topic in the reverse, as I'll explain in a moment. This Braisa shitas Chachamim. This Braisa befedish speaks about a kuti and a goy, puts them together. So we're going to prove that lechachamim, a kuti and a goy dinam echad. Now, what is this Braisa talking about? Our Mishnah is speaking about the owner is a Yid, the owner is a goy, the owner is a kuti, and the mekabel or the others are Yid. That's the case of our Mishnah. The Braisa is speaking about the reverse. What happens if you have a Jewish owner, and the Jewish owner hired what type of worker? Either a Jewish worker, or, as we'll see, or a goy or a kuti. And as we spoke on the words of introduction, midoiraisa loisichanim means you're not allowed to allow a goy to own land. That's isur doiraisa. And in extension, midrabanan, you cannot lease it out to them. Here we're speaking about someone that violated isur derabanan. Let's read it inside. Hanois, and so they obey Kabbalah. The Jew, the owner, is giving out his field to a worker, to I'm a kabel. Here we go. L'goy ulakuti. And now we have a third category, ulamisha eino neman ala maisras, just for the record, that in our braisa, lemisha eino neman is dafkin, not the am haaretz. That's not the case. We're speaking about someone who's even worse than the am haaretz, someone who we know, it's called the Yisrael, that's chashud, a yid that we know is not careful and separating trumas and maisras. Not the am haaretz that rubam, we already learned, are toidim uma'ased everything. The problem is that there is a substantial minority that don't. Everything. They do some, not everything. This chashud is worse. Now, I just want to say that before we read on what we have, I want to go inside the Shinun Eschois. Look inside the Shinun Eschois, Ois Gimel. Just he adds words that like we spoke out, even though the owner was not allowed to give out his field b'Kabbalah to a guy, right? Nevertheless, the Braisa is speaking about a case that he did it. And now let's go. Now the Braisa will speak about the difference, whether he leased it out when there was basically nothing on the ground, or even if there's something was already growing, it did not reach the benchmark that we called Oinas HaMaisvus. And we keep on learning it for those of us who are learning 3 chapters of Rambam. We had it like just 2 weeks ago. So there are a couple of stages when it comes to Maisis. I know we always spoke about the Miruach or the Iyas Pnei Habayis. That's the last stage, after which, since you're chayiv to be Toirim Uma'asir, you can't even eat Achilas Aray if you didn't do it. I want to go to the other side of the equation. And that is that prior to the produce reaching Oinas HaMaisvus, I know it's correct to say generally a third of its growth, even though really it's custom made for every item. Some items, it's not about a third, it's about a certain benchmark. But prior to it being B'chlal Oichel, it's not that you're not chayiv to be ma'aseh. There is nothing to be ma'aseh. When produce reaches Oinas HaMaisvus, that means it reached a third. Let's say by Tvua, it's shlish. And you went ahead and you harvested it. And you did not make a miruach yet. You're not chayiv to tithe it, but if you tithed it, what you did is valid because you separated trumas and maisres on food, on oichel. Prior to something reaching oinas and maisres, even if you separated and you declared this is truma, those words are nonsensical and it's nothing. And you can't, it's not tebel, it's nothing. So that's the case. So in other words, in the case where it erst became fit under the care of the goy, if you leased it out prior to Einas HaMaisres, listen to these words, and now the goy, the Mekabel, worked the land, and under his care, the produce came into the world. Now, it goes even to a case when you leased out a fallow field. Same thing, there was nothing there. Even if there was something there, it's all the same, vis-a-vis Maisres, if he did not own it when it already was shayach to be tied. So in that case, now listen to this. The goy is not doing anything. The owner, the balabas, guys, this is the Rabbanon, is obligated to tithe. Of course, the owner has to tithe his share. Let's say the Makabel gets 50%, so the balabas gets 50%. That the owner, the yid, has to tithe his 50% is not a chiddush. The vart is that the sharecropper, right, who is expecting to get half, the balabas will not keep half. Because not only does the balabas have to be toilim ma'asad his half, which he'll have to do anyways, he has to be toilim ma'asad everything. Sarech la'asad al yodoi mishabolo oinas ha'maisres. And all of that is a penalty on the balabas for him violating this Isur D'Rabbanan of giving out his field b'Kabbalah to a non-Yid. Okay? And that goes, but look at this, that goes, the Braisa is putting the Goy and the Kuti and Eino Neman in the same package. Now, this Isur D'Rabbanan doesn't go necessarily on the Kuti, if a Kuti is a Yid. Certainly doesn't go on the Misha Eino Neman. But there's another issue. The issue is that since they will not be Toidem Uma'asir, you're chayiv to do it. And that will be a loss for the balabas because, again, let's say Trumas Amaisis is around 22%. The guy says half is mine. If you're taking from my half, complement it with chulin. Okay. That is when you would list it as a makabel prior. 1 second. Now, next case is also when you're leasing it before it reached afal shaloi balo oinas hamaisnis. The next case will be that your makabel is a normal am haaretz. Hanois and so they have makabel am haaretz. Here the halacha will be that actually bolo oinas hamaisnis. In other words, let me just go back. What will be if you leased it out after it came to Oinas HaMaisres, Mendel? Then for sure the balabas tzarich la'asad al yadam. It's the same din. But the chiddush is, once there was already Oinas HaMaisres, then you leasing it out to a guy is even more problematic. Why is it more problematic? Because there was produce that if it would have stayed the way it is under the ownership of a Yid, the Kohen and the Levi would get their Trumas HaMaisres. You made an agreement, which is basically like robbing the Kohen and the Levi. So the chiddush is that not only if it reached Oinas HaMaisres and Esh, then you leased it out to the Goy, or to the Kuti, or to the Chashin. You are chayiv, you the owner, you're chayiv to take up Trumas HaMaisres from everything. Even Afal Pi Shaloi Balo Oinas HaMaisres, that's the same. However, in contrast, if you give your field to Stamen Ha'aretz, so then we do differentiate. Then we say, if you leased it out to this Hamaretz prior to there even being food on the field, don't forget that the owner can rightfully say, this Hamaretz will be Toidim Ma'ased everything. Roiv Ma'ased. It's not on me. Even though when the Mekabel, the Hamaretz will sell this produce to a Chaver, the Chaver will have to be Noyeg and this Kidin Demai. I know that. But the owner doesn't have to be concerned, how am I allowing produce not to be fully tight? He can say, this guy will fully tight. But once he leased it out, once it hit Oinas HaMaisres, here also, Tzarech la'asir al yadav. Okay. Now, I want to make first, if you remember the logic that we had yesterday in the Braisa, when we introduced the Braisa and the Gemara, that our Mishnah is only Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, the Chachamim hold Toidim. If you remember, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel argued with the Chachamim by saying that you can't say Toidim. Why can you not say Toidim? The case in the Mishnah was the owner was a Goy. Because since the Goy doesn't want to take it off, and he's not chayiv to take it off, he's not a bar mitzvah, how can the Jew take it off on his behalf? If he's not obligated, how can I do it on his behalf? That was the reason why Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel holds choylek lifneim. You can't say that a Jew is being toidim on behalf of the goy. The same logic will apply over here. Here we're speaking about the mekabel is a goy. Speaking about the reisha of this brayse. The goy doesn't have to tithe. How can the balabas tithe on his behalf? How can he even do it? In other words, the logic that the Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel used yesterday to argue with the Chachamim, that logic is here as well. The fact that this Braisa holds, in the case of the Reisha of this Braisa, that the Balabas has to separate all of the Maisres, first of all, that's a proof that our Braisa is not Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. It's the Chachamim. Now, our Braisa, that's the Chachamim, here it's Gavaldik, does not differentiate between a Goy and a Kuti. So that's the way the Gemara answers the question. But Mela, when we learned yesterday, the Chachamim Oimrim Toidim v'Noistam Loi, the Toidim v'Noistam Loi isn't only in the case of the Braisa yesterday, where the owner is a Goy, Nachri, it will also be when the owner is a Kuti. That concludes the answer. Okay. And now let's take a step back. So when we learned today's Braisa, we said, by the Enoch, we had the Girsa Afal Pisha Ener Rishoi. Afal Pisha Ener Rishoi is only Midrabanan. Midoiraisa, the prohibition of a Jewish landowner to lease his land to a guy is only an Issa Darabanan. The Midoiraisa is only to sell it. So why did we say it's Asur Midrabanan? Because since V'loi Sichanim, he should not buy it, should not own it, don't even lease it to them. What happens in a place where there are no Jews there? perhaps there's no Isur D'Rabbanan. That's the Gemara's clash. At Kedoin, that it's Asur Midrabanan to lease land to a non-Yid. That's B'Makim She Yisrael Mitzuyim. So it's like a Geder. But what happens B'Makim She'ein Yisrael Mitzuyim? There are no Jews there. And let me add to that, like we learned yesterday, like we repeated today, the counter, the other side of this whole topic that we don't want to have Goyim working on the land, the counter to that, or we don't want you to work for Goyim on the land, is that what will be the alternative for the land to remain fallow? We don't want for that to happen. So if you don't have an option, so maybe there's no Isur D'Rabbanan. The Isur D'Oraisa won't change. Perhaps. Just to say, for Isur D'Oraisa to change, that goes into the whole topic, whether you're Dorshin on Talmud Kro or Loi. That Rashbi was Doirish Talmud Kro. We have such a shita that even on Isur D'Oraisa, we are allowed to suggest the reason, and therefore to say where the reason does not apply, the Isur D'Oraisa does not apply. That Rashbi we have in the Isur D'Oraisa of a person who is borrowing from an almana, lending money to a almana that you can't take a mashkin from her. That's an Isur D'Oraisa. Says Rashbi, why can't you take a mashkin? Because since the din is that you, the lender, you have to return the mashkin to a poor borrower, something that they need. Like, for example, if the borrower is going to give you their mattress, their bed, you have to return it to them every night. If the borrower is going to give you his working utensils from which he makes a living, you have to give it to him every morning. So otherwise you'll be constantly going and coming, getting and receiving from the borrower. And almana, that's going to constantly come and go to get her bed, to give her bed. There'll be a chshad. People are going to start to be moitzilas, both on the lender and on the almana. So to prevent that, you're not allowed to take a mashkin. Says Rav Shimon ben Gamliel, says Rashbi, that's the reason. And based on that, if the person has two beds, the person has two work utensils, they don't need you don't need to return the mashkin, then you could take a mashkin from an almana. Just as an example. I'm saying over here, our Gemara is asking the question only on the issue of leasing, which is an Isur D'Rabbanan. What about on the Oraisa? That depends. If you're Doirish Talmud Kro, you can argue the same thing. That Veloisi Chanem, don't give them a holding in the land if they already have a holding in the land. No one else will buy it. Maybe not. Does this apply today? Yeah. Mamish. Okay, where's Edo? Here we go. In other words, let me go in the reverse. That the great mitzvah for Yidden to buy land in Eretz Yisrael. That's part of mitzvahs Eretz Yisrael. For Hashem wants for Eretz Yisrael to belong to the Jewish people.
Edo is here.
I know. I just saw. All right.
Yes, I am.
Okay, so Bekitza, that's the kasha. The Gemara is going to try to resolve this inquiry. Nishme'ina min hada. Rapsimin. We just learned a few daf ago that in the area Bisman Chazal, this time of Rapsimin, Har HaMelech was a place that was primarily inhabited by Goyim. So he owned land. And Shaul at Rabbi Yechanan, whether what, he was not planning to sell anything, whether he can have Goyim who live there work on his lands, whether there's an Isur Befedish. So Amar Lei, Rabbi Yechanan responded to Rab Simen that what? Yoiviru, better for the land to remain desolate, fallow, but don't violate the Isur D'Rabbanan. In other words, Rabbi Yechanan said it applies even when there are no Jews that are Mesuyim. However, that's Rabbi Yechanan. Rabbi Shua ben Levi argues. Rabbi Shua ben Levi, and he Ushrale. In other words,
he asked two Rabbanim.
He
asked two Rabbanim. Rabbi
Simon asked the Shaila twice. Head to the shopping, but here we have a Machlekes Hamoraim. Now says the Gemara, Rabbi Shua ben Levi, that. Why did he say
Rabbi,
that?
Can you just clarify in the case where he leased it out and Rabbi Shua ben Levi is saying he's allowed to do that, right?
Yep.
So the produce that's harvested by that non-Jewish sharecropper, this guy goes and sells it. It's Chayiv and Meiser still, right?
We just learned the Braisa right now that in such an agreement, the owner, according to the Chachamim, which is the halacha, das Rabin, the owner is chayiv, even though this guy, the goy, is getting half. He's already getting tithe produce. The owner is going to be toivim uma'ased everything.
Right, but
Actually, I take that back.
was,
No. Then I take that back because
it doesn't apply here.
Yeah, why did we say that? It's almost like a decree. It's a decree.
Right.
It's a penalty. Very good. I'm sorry. According to Rabbi Shua ben Levi, if there is no Isur D'Rabbanan, then l'chu'ura, the goy will get his half. That's untied. Produce that grew in a field of a Jew, that when a Yid buys it from the goy, he has to tithe it. It's Tavel Gomer.
So this goes back to the Machlekes Reb Meir, right?
100%.
As to whether
you chayv to no, it doesn't, because Rav Meir holds that Ein Kinyan, and Rav Shimon holds Yesh Kinyan. The guy doesn't own anything; he's only a worker there.
Oh, but he's a Kabbalah, no?
Doesn't matter; he doesn't own the land. Here, the Jew is the owner of the land. Here, L'Kula Almetz Tabel Gomer.
Okay.
Only question is, if you were not allowed to lease it to him, so then you have a penalty. So that's it. So Rabbi Shua ben Levi, that Makim She'en Yisrael Mitzuyim, which is the case of Haram Melech at that time, should be like the din of Surya. Now, 1 second. What are we talking about? So it's very important. So I know I mentioned this before you turn to Ahmed Beis, he quotes in the bottom, look inside the Pnei Moshe. Second to last line, all the way in the bottom. That Makim She'en Yisrael Mitzuyim, which is the case of Haram Melech Muter. Muter means Lachatchila, you are allowed to lease it out to a non-Jew. Why? Because it should be like Surya, which means really that's subject to a machlokes tanoim. Rav Meir holds that even in Surya you're not allowed to lease it out. Imagine. Rabbi Yosi is the one that holds that you are allowed to. Rabbi Yosi the Hasan b'Masnisen. Keep on reading in the Pnei Moshe. The Kiv and the Shasat Chaku. Meaning that I know they're speaking about Surya. Surya is a whole different thing. Surya is kibush yachid. In other words, it's not bona fide that it's Yisrael. However, here the question of Rab Simon was on Haramela. The question of Rab Simon wasn't in Eretz Yisrael proper, but it's Shasat Chak. Why? The Ein Yisrael Mitzuyim. Muter after Shalom Kamis Ben Yisrael coming Shemot B'Surya. In other words, the logic of Rabbi Shua ben Levi was to compare Haramelech, to compare it to Surya, turning to Daf Nun Beis Amid Beis. Oh, now the Hadah Surya. The Gemara wants to clarify from where do we know that we paskin like Rabbi Yosi? In other words, we know everyone knew this is the machlokes kanoim. Everyone knew the machlokes Rav Meir and Rabbi Yosi. How do you know we paskin like Rabbi Yosi? Parenthetically, we just quoted not that long ago Erev and Daf Navav in the Babli, where we have the klali of halacha. In the klali of halacha, not only Rabbi Yosi and Mukha Imai with others, on the other hand, Rav Meir, we don't paskin like Rav Meir because ein chachamim yordim l'soiv datar. It means Rav Meir and Rabbi Yosi, halacha ke Rabbi Yosi. But the Gemara is not going with that klal. The Gemara is asking, how do we know what we paskin here like Rabbi Yosi specifically? From another story. Nishmeina min Ador, that Rab Chagai, Nochas lachamotz. Rab Chagai lived in the Holy Land. And Nochas means, there's Aliyah. Today, Yishuv Eretz Yisrael is called Aliyah. What's the opposite of Aliyah? Yerida. Nochas. Nochas means to go down. It means he lived in the Holy Land and he went down. That means he moved out of the Holy Land. But to where did he move? To a place called Chametz. Chametz was in Surya. And also Sha'alon Elaine Devar Ashtoir. So now we have a big Amoira, Rab Chagai. When he came to that city, so the family members, right, the Bar Ashtoir came and asked him that begin the Leis Yisrael Shchichen. Now the guys, they happen to be in Surya. So it's not just that Yidna not Shchichen. Our topic Haramelech, Yisrael were not Mitzuyin in Eretz Yisrael. There they were in Chametz. But they said, since Yidna not here, Ba'anan Moigrin La'amim, and we are leasing it out to Goyim over there in Surya. Do we have to do this Zayda D'Rabbanan? And we just made that link properly. Whenever you are allowed to lease it to a Goy, you're not going to be penalized. So that's what they were asking. And so they asked this to Rab Chagai. Rab Chagai didn't know, but Rab Chagai knew the people who knew. That's most Rabbanim today. The Rav doesn't know, but you have access to the other Rav. Sholach, Shol, Rab Ze'era, here we go. So he asked Rab Ze'era, and Rab Ze'era didn't know. Shol, Rab Ze'era, Rab Imi, and finally, Amalei, Rab Imi responded, Einoit Tzarech La'asir Al Yedeihen. Einoit Tzarech La'asir Al Yedeihen. Now, all of that is based on what? halacha ke Rabbi Yossi. Because if halacha would have been ke Rav Meir, and if we would have passed it like Rabbi Yochanan, you're not allowed to do it. If you're not allowed to do it, and you're going to get penalized. The fact that we did not penalize them is a raya that he passed it like Rabbi Yossi. In other words, mina at shama lahaski ke Rabbi Yossi. So, by the way, this now, Rabbi Yossi spoke about Surya, guys. The case in the Gemara, the story, Rav Imi's psak was Surya. Our kasha was haramel. We're not proving from over there the same would apply. That was the logic of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. What the Gemara is trying to find out on the top of Daf Nun Beis is not how did Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi know to make that link between Surya and Eretz Yisrael. Just to know, how do we know that in Surya proper we paskin like Rabbi Yossi? We paskin like Rabbi Yossi in Surya. So now Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi on his own made this hekish to a Haramelech as well. So that's number one. Another proof that we paskin like Rabbi Yossi in Surya for Oid min Hadah, the Omar Rabbi Chanina, the Rebbe Rababo, that Abba, my father, which means Rababo, have a Yuvda. In other words, he owned the field in Syria. And Shalach Shal Rabbi Chia, Ul Rabbi Asa, Ul Rabbi Imi, whether he can lease it to a goy. So now we're ultimately not only getting the same psak from Rabbi Imi, we are adding Rabbi Asa, we're adding Rabbi Chia, and V'hoidon lei lahaskiv ke Rabbi Yossi. How great is that? Or look inside the gears of the Marafulda. He has a better gears. He says V'hoidon lei lahaskiv. Look at the gears, guys. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. How great is that? No, that's even better. Because once according to Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, that even though the case of Rabbi Chanina, just for the record, the case of Rabbi Chanina wasn't Surya, but now we have Ravimi and the other two Amoraim, Rabbi Yasa and Rabbi Chia, they're passing that even in Eretz Yisrael, not like Rabbi Yochanan, which is a big chiddush, b'makim she'en Yisrael mitzuyim, like in Haramelech. There's no rabbinic decree. A Yid owns it. A Yid is not allowed to sell it, but he can lease it out to a goy. And therefore, the Gemara concludes that hola asad al yedayim ain't on asad al yedayim. If you are allowed to lease it out to a goy, we're not going to penalize you. That link that we just made, it goes hand in hand. If it would be also you're penalized since it's muted, so then you don't have to separate the trumas u'maisves. Of course, from your chelik you have to, not from the goyish chelik. And that guy, when he will sell his produce, a Yid will know that it's Tevel Gamur. Says the Gemara. Braisa. Kibel mimenu sada lixer bechita. If you lease out a field from an owner, and you leased it when the field already had full-grown chitim, and your job was only to harvest it. Or anavim, when you leased out the field, the grapes were developed, and your job was to put them into, to make them into wine. Zeisim limsek b'shemen. Okay. The sharecropper was not hired until when the produce was mamish ready to harvest. Guys, you get the case? That's not like the case of the Mishnah. So the din is ma'ased b'noisten loy. Wow, are we that the mekabel has to be ma'ased everything. In our Mishnah, what did we learn, Chevra? Our Mishnah is Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. Our Mishnah did not even differentiate between a Yid and a Goy. What did our Mishnah say? That if you're mekabel or sada, no matter who the owner is, the Mishnah says that you don't have to tithe anything to the owner. Of course, you have to tithe your portion. Here, the Braisa is saying, our Mishnah is speaking about a case, you leased a field, normal, you worked the land, you grew the produce, you leave the owner his part. Here it's different. Here, everything was already grown. It was not harvested. You were not obligated to tithe it yet. I get that. What's going on over here? Since the product was fully grown before the Yid before the owner even hired the makabel now was chayiv to separate trumas u'maisres, not just trumas, ma'aser v'noisres. Trek the Gemara, hold on. Eisa chamei means tashuma. Come in here, dakasha. Right, the case of our Mishnah, if he would have been hired prior to it being planted, normal case of makabel, our Mishnah said choylek. Correct. Choylek means he doesn't need to do anything on the share of the owner. In our Mishnah, even if the owner is a goy, for sure if the owner is a yid. So asks the Gemara that what makes the Braisa different from the Mishnah? Simply from the fact Misha Zara. Now, really, it's much more than Misha Zara. I want to make that clear, because Misha Zara really it's Mishabol lo'oinas hamaistes. That's the ikr, but that's what it means. It's because it was planted. So why would that be mechayiv him to be ma'aser? Why? No, it's why. I understand it's different cases, but why would it matter regarding our topic? So what that the mekabel got it once it was planted? Really, once it was already fully ripe. So the Gemara clarifies, Amar Rabbi Chinana, that tiknu b'mekabel shaloi tavad eretz Yisrael. What's the pros and the cons? The pros and the cons are, on one hand, there's a logic to say you have to separate. You're a yid, you're working with the land, you're going to give it back to a Jew. Maybe the Jew won't be toidim ma'aser. How can you even take it off the threshing floor without being toidim it? Separate everything. The reason why they did not say that is because they don't want the land of Eretz Yisrael to remain fallow. It's going to be harder to find mekabelim if they will have to be toidim ma'aser. And just to make it clear, it's not just more work. It's going to go out of their pocket because the owner wants to get half. The owner knows that there is 10 pounds. And therefore, the owner is expecting now to get 5 pounds. And if the mekabel, if the worker will have to separate all the trumas or maisnes, the 5 pounds that he'll end up giving to the owner, which will already be mesukanim, will be fixed, will be on the cheshbon of the mekabel. So we don't do that because he's not going to want to work. Now, if the whole reason why he's off the hook of separating the trumas or maisnes on behalf of the owner is because we don't want shaloi tavad eretz Yisrael, we don't want the land to remain fallow. Whenever he was hired and that field was already planted, that field is not fallow.
But you think it would be the opposite?
No. That's gavaldik. In other words, this land, we want for Israel to be filled with produce. This field was already filled with produce. But over here, zoirohu. So therefore, there's no reason to give an exemption. Now, let's just conclude. Let me just conclude with one thing. So he has to do everything. However, what happens if kibel mimenu sadel lixer bishibalin? All right, I'm reading. At least this is the girsa bishibalin. I know b'shachar. That's the girsa of the Mara. You can see over the Mara folder. In other words, here we have no fear for the field to be left fallow because you're buying already grown produce. But the Braisa is going to give you a case that there is an exception. Even when the field is already not fallow, there will still be a case where you won't have to take trumas or maisnes. So either if you were hired simply to put the grown grain, to cut it and to put it into bundles. To put it into bundles means that you were not hired to take it all the way to the finish line. The finish line will be the meruach. All you were hired to do was liktzoir b'shibalin, to put it into bundles. Or
is that before or after the meruach? Before?
Before, way before. Or let's go to the daf of Nun Gimel. You were hired in a field, in a vineyard that were already filled with ripe grapes. Your job is only to put it into the grape basket. That's also before the meruach, because most grapes were grown to make it into wine. So the final phase, it's when it's in the wine press. You were not hired to bring it all the way to the finish line. Or zaysim, only limsek b'salei zaysim. In that case, even though you got the field when it was already filled, maniach kamay sheheim, because you can only be machayiv you to tithe it if there's a chiyuv to tithe. I know that you could tithe once the produce higia lo einas hamaisres and it was harvested. If the balabas decided to separate trumas b'shibalim, what he did is done. But there's no obligation to do it. So if there's no obligation to do it, you can't throw it on top of the mekabel.